Okay, hi everyone. I would like to welcome you to our second webinar. Um, I really hope everyone's doing well. I really hope that you are having a great experience in the nano degree. Um, I would like I would also like to congratulate everyone who has managed to pass the first project already, even though it's Wednesday and the project deadline is not due until Sunday. So you've managed to complete the projects 4 days before the deadline, which is a great start. Um, that will also allow you to spend a little bit more time studying the material for the second project, which will not be like the first one. It's much harder actually. So uh, when I was doing my second project, I didn't really know that it would be as difficult as it was for me. But then again, I was not very good at JavaScript, so maybe that's normal. But it took me a long time to do. I mean, I I submitted it after the deadline, and I actually had to resubmit it because it was not good enough. And so I suggest that you really plan this out because it might turn out to be a very difficult task. But don't worry, I'm not trying to intimidate you or anything. I just want to make sure that you approach this with the appropriate knowledge and that you have enough time to do it on in the deadline so you don't fall behind. Um, Speaking of the first project, something that is really important, and not just for the project, but for web development in general, is Flexbox. And that's what's actually going to be the topic of this webinar. I decided to take special time to review this concept, this theme in the CSS language because it's really helpful. And I think that, especially for the first project, you're going to have benefits if you know and can work with it well. Of course, we're not gonna talk through all of the concepts in Flexbox because it's a huge topic and a mere 1 hour is not gonna be enough to explain even half of what Flexbox is all about. But take this as a general overview and uh, building block to further your understanding of Flexbox. Okay, so let's begin. I have prepared a little presentation which I will make available to you, of course, after the webinar if you find it useful. So let's switch to that. Um, there we go. Okay. So this is the first slide. Let's go to the second one. And this is our agenda for today, for this webinar. First, we'll start off nice and easy with what Flexbox is and why you should use it. Here we'll have a brief description of what Flexbox is. Next, we'll go to the benefits of using Flexbox. Well, we're not going to discuss all of them. We'll just have a look at some of the benefits Flexbox offers us. After that, we'll go to the really fundamental concepts every um, behind everything Flexbox offers, and after that, we're gonna dive into the properties themselves that Flexbox is made of. And after that, I will try to demonstrate in action what Flexbox is, and we'll make use of CodePen for that. Um, And after that, I have assembled a list of Flexbox resources I think you're gonna find beneficial. And after that, we'll get some questions if anyone has any questions. And finally, I will show a brief demo of a project that I built last year that made use of Flexbox only. So you'll get a good idea of what knowing Flexbox um, can do. So if you know Flexbox, you'll see design that's entirely made of Flexbox. So let's begin. So first and foremost, we will see what Flexbox is and why we should use it. As you can see, Flexbox is a module in the CSS3 language. If you're wondering what that 3 is behind CSS, that's actually the latest version of CSS, of the CSS language that was released a few years ago. There was CSS1, CSS2, and now it's CSS3. And what module is, that's essentially the building blocks that programming language is made of. So you have modules like CSS Grid, Flexbox, and all the others that make that's combined together to make the CSS language. And CSS3 has the module Flexbox, which makes it easy to align elements to one another in different directions and orders. So what that means that you can probably picture any kind of layout, side to side, top to bottom, left to right, everything, and do it with Flexbox. The main idea behind the new module in CSS Flexbox is to give the container, here we're talking about a Flex container that contains all the items, the ability to expand and to shrink elements to best use all the available space. That means that to expand and shrink elements, that comes in useful when we are designing a responsive website or web app and need to accommodate users with smaller screens or larger ones. And then we have to expand and shrink elements. Flexbox is one of the best tools you can use, actually the best one you can use if you want to design a responsive layout for your users. Um, Here is a bit of a very important benefit of Flexbox is that it replaces float layouts using less and more readable and logical code. A float layout, for those of you who don't know what that is, before Flexbox, developers had to use margins and paddings and display properties to achieve a simple layout, a really simple layout. The code for building this simple layout included a ton of CSS attributes and values, which made it really complex to understand. And it was really a nightmare to design something for a single viewport and much less have it responsive across all the viewports. And luckily, Flexbox allows us to do that. And finally, we can say that Flexbox, excuse me, completely changes the way that we build one-dimensional layouts. So a one-dimensional layout, um, you can think of that as what you see on the page. I mean, you can't have um, elements overlapping each other, rotating and that kind of stuff. That's a multi-dimensional layout, and that's a topic for CSS Grid. I think we're going to have a webinar um, in the coming weeks about that too, but Flexbox is best for a one-dimensional layout, and for multi-dimensional layouts, it's not as good, simply. Um, okay, we go to the benefits of using Flexbox. This is a quote from the makers of Flexbox. The Flex layout is superficially similar to block layouts, the one we explained earlier. It lacks many of the more complex text or document-centric properties that can be used in block layouts. This essentially means all the CSS properties and attributes and all that stuff, such as floats and columns, which were really annoying. And to be fair to you, I really don't think I can uh, do uh, or construct the layouts that I have constructed in the past if I'm not using Flexbox and instead floats and column layouts. Um, so in return, it gains simple and powerful tools for distributing space and aligning content in ways that web apps and complex web pages often need. If you've been online, you most likely have come across a website that's really cool. I mean, it has all these dynamically placed elements, and that's probably the work of Flexbox. So we go to the main advantages of Flexbox. Um, the first one is that it is supported in all major browsers. This is really essential because if it's not supported in all major browsers, you will have to provide a fallback, which is a very daunting task, and we will have to use transpilers more than likely to make the codes you write understandable to the browsers. And the need for that is actually eliminated with Flexbox because it has support for all the major browsers apart from Internet Explorer 10 and the versions before that. But nowadays, the number of people that use these browsers is so low that actually the makers of these browsers, Microsoft, say that you can completely disregard them. So the percentage of support is even higher than 95%. The next advantage is that you can finally center an element easily. Back when I was starting out as a front-end developer wannabe, um, I was trying to build my own projects, and almost inevitably, I came across the problem that I have to simply center an element inside its container. And after minutes of thinking how I'm supposed to do that, I decided that I really can't do any web development because I can't do something as simple as centering an element on a page. And with Flexbox, actually, when I learned Flexbox eventually, I understood that with only three declarations in the CSS file, you can center an element. And that really relieved me because until then, I found it really hard to center elements on the page. So the third advantage is that you can manipulate inline elements easily. So Flexbox has a good integration with inline elements, meaning that we can align them in any way we want, side by side, one on top of another, horizontally, all that stuff. And the fourth advantage is responsive layouts. As I said before, Flexbox allows us to create a beautiful layout for all the spectrum of devices that includes phones, tablets, big screens, normal PC screens, all that, which is very handy. You can accommodate more users if your site or web app is um, accessible on all of these viewports and all of these devices. So The fifth one is that you don't have to worry about syntax. Using autoprefixer, which is a software, you'll probably learn about that later in the nano degree. What an autoprefixer does is to take the CSS you've already written and apply some vendor prefixes to all the rules. So, for example, if you have display um, whatever block um, for every um, for every web browser, autoprefixer has its knows its appropriate prefix and puts a bit of text before the property itself. So instead of display block, we will have for Mozilla Firefox, for example, um, hyphen mouse hyphen display block. For Opera, it's I think hyphen op hyphen display block, and for Google Chrome, it's hyphen WebKit hyphen display. So you get the picture. Um, and using this auto prefixer, we can specify which browser versions we want to support, and the correct vendor prefixes will be automatically added. So that means we can use Flexbox on pretty much every browser. Um, and the sixth one, it simplifies complexity. We already said about that Flexbox allows us to achieve complex layouts we already could create with float layouts, but now we can do it in much less code than we used to. That were some of the um, advantages that Flexbox gives us. There are much more, and I'm sure you'll come to see that it really does provide us with a handy tool in our CSS toolbox. Now, let's move to a bit more of the theoretical side of things, um, and that's the fundamentals, the main axis, the cross axis, the flex container, and the flex items. So we'll take a look at all of the four and try to understand a bit what's going on. So now, don't be scared. We're not going to study mathematics today. Um, I'm sure you have most likely have encountered the concept of axis in maths at one time or another. Here we have a bit modified version of that. So let's get into it. Okay, let's first we'll identify the flex container, which is this pink colored rectangle here on the page. And the flex container is the place where flex items, these red boxes, are being housed. So the moment you set the display property of the flex container to flex or to flex inline, you can actually disregard this flex inline value of display because it's actually pretty much never used. So we will focus our attention only to flex inline. Okay, so when you set the display property of the flex container to flex, that means you are creating a Flexbox environment, and you should immediately take into account these two axes. This is the main axis that goes from left to the right of the flex container, and this is the cross axis which goes from top to bottom. And actually this is the only difference from what we studied previously in school in maths, because the y-axis, as we used to call it, usually went from the bottom to the top and not from the top to the bottom. But that's how the web browser um, renders these axes. So in the browser environment, the cross-axis or the y-axis goes from top to bottom, and the main axis, the x-axis, as we studied it in school, is no different. It goes from the left to the right. So um, why are these axes placed here? Well, actually, Flexbox makes use of the two properties which um, are for the main and for the cross-axis separately. So with one of them, justify content, that's what's the name of the property. We control how these flex items are positioned along this main axis. So currently, along the main axis, we have the elements positioned centrally, and there is equal space between them. So they're symmetrically placed. We'll see how to do that a bit later. Along the cross-axis, we see that the flex items are positioned in the center of the cross-axis, from equal distance from the top and from the bottom. And so that's this alignment here. What you should always take into consideration the main axis and the cross axis. Um, let's expand a bit more on that. As we said, the main axis determines the direction in which flex items are laid out horizontally. So here is another picture of the main axis. It starts from the left and goes all the way to here to the right. And that's the main axis size, this here. These are the two flex items, and this is where the main axis starts, and this is where it ends. So the cross axis starts all the way from here and goes up to here, the cross end, then the cross start. Okay, um, this is the flex container, the dark gray, and uh, the positioning, the vertical positioning of the items, the flex items, is controlled via the cross axis. The horizontal one is on the main axis. That's the default way it is in Flexbox. There is a opportunity to rotate the axis, but we'll get into that a bit later. I don't want to overwhelm you right now. It's not an easy thing to grasp at first, but you should always remember this picture here. The main axis going from the left to the right, and the cross axis going from the top to the bottom. Okay, that's axis covered. And now let's get into the actual Flexbox properties. We'll quickly go over them, and after that I will try to demonstrate them all in action. Okay, so Flexbox has a different set of properties for the Flex container and for the Flex items. So what we use on the Flex container, we cannot use on Flex items, and vice versa, of course. What we use on the Flex items, we can't use on the Flex container. Here we have the picture with the main axis again and the cross axis, the Flex container and the Flex items. Okay, let's have a look at the properties for the container. The first one is the flex direction. This determines where the main axis points to. So its default value is rho. Okay, I should mention that here are the values, and the ones that are bold are the default values. This is what these properties will default to if we don't specify them. So if we don't explicitly say flex wrap should be wrap reverse, for example, that will default to no wrap. Also, we should, if we want the flex direction to stay at its default value, which is row, there is no need to write in our style sheets flex direction row. That's completely redundant and only um, makes your file larger and harder to process by the browsers. Okay, so um, the the flex direction, as I said, controls the positioning of the main axis, and if it's in a row, it points from the left to the right. Okay, so if we go and put row reverse, the axis is going to switch from left to right, and it will be from right to left. So now all this element comes here, this one comes here, and this one stays here. So just the order is reversed. Okay, if we specify that the flex direction should have a column value, that means that we switch the places of the main and the cross axis. So now the main axis goes from left to right to going from top to the bottom, and the cross axis goes from left to right. So now these elements will be stacked one on top of the other instead of being horizontally placed. And the column reverse, I'm sure you understand what that does. It's the same as row reverse. It just moves the elements in the opposite order. What flex wrap does is to, when we are resizing our viewports, the viewport is just the width of the screen we're on. So if we resize this element, so now if you resize the container and the viewport turns out to be smaller than the width of the container, like for example, we can see only 3 elements. If we set the flex wrap to wrap, these 2 elements that were previously not visible will move onto a new row right here and will still be visible. The wrap reverse does actually, of course, it does the same thing. It starts wrapping from here instead of from the end. We will see all these properties in action. I know it's not clear right now, but we'll just go through them a bit later. The justify content, as I said before, controls the positioning of the flex items in the main axis. And there's a bunch of weird looking values for this property. We will test them all out in just a bit. And then the justify content, it's important to remember that it controls the positioning from the main to the main axis of the flex items. Contrary to that, align items control the positioning of the flex items from on the cross axis, so from top to bottom. There's a bunch of different looking values for that. We'll see them in action later. And the align content property is a bit special. We will also see that in action a bit later. Onto the item, the flex items properties, we have there's align self, which allows us to control the positioning of a flex item, a specific unique flex item, and have it positioned differently from all the others. The order, as you can possibly guess, controls the positioning of the flex items in the container. The flex grow dictates how much an item can grow, having available space in the container. And the flex shrink does the same, but for shrinking. Actually, the flex basis is what we're gonna use to define the width of each flex item. We're not gonna use the width property like we've previously done for flex items. We will use flex basis. That's a thing to remember. And these three properties, flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis, all combine into the shorthand flex property. Here the first value is for the flex grow, the flex shrink is the second value, and the flex basis is the third value. Okay, so that was the overview for the properties, and now let's see what they're all about in action. And for that, we're gonna switch to CodePen, which is an online tool for um, this purpose. Here we go. This is a little mock-up I did to show you Flexbox in action. And a bit of explanation. We have a simple div with a class of container, which contains of 5 items with flex items, which are gonna be are gonna have the item class shared between them, and that's all of the HTML. Pretty simple. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for all the elements. Now onto the CSS part. This here is an asterisk symbol, and this is what is used to select all the elements in the page. You will almost never use this symbol because it's wrong to apply styles with this to all the elements on the page. But the general selectors, as it's called, is used for global resets. So a global reset is applied to every single property, and right now I'm setting the padding and the margin to be 0 for every single element, as well as its box sizing to be border box. Some HTML elements have built-in padding or margins, like for instance the UL, an ordered list element, has built-in padding, and that can render bad on the page and make you wonder where a certain padding and misplacement is happening. And that's why I'm setting these things to 0 in order for me to have control over what has padding and what has margin. Of course, the border box, that means that the width of an element that has its box sizing set to border box will contain all the margin and the padding. So if, for example, we have element with 100 pixels width, if we add a margin of 10 pixels, the width of the total width of the element will stay at 100 pixels, and the margin will be incorporated in it. So the content will be 90 pixels and the margin will stay at 10. If we don't specify this box sizing to border box, it will default to content box, which means that if our element has 100 pixel width, adding a margin of 10 pixels will add an extra 10 pixels to the total width, and now it will be 110 pixels. And that can sometimes be a problem. Other than that, for the container, we have a simple background color property and a padding of 1 rem. If you're confused what rem is, that's just a measurement unit like the pixels we use, but it's good for responsive design because it references the root elements. Actually, that's what rem means, root elements. And the root element size is almost always 16 pixels. Okay, so for the items, we have a background color property, we have some padding, some margins, and a white color for the text. and a bit of a increased font size for 4 RAM. Okay, let's go. So the first thing to do when using Flexbox is actually to set the display property of the container to flex. And immediately we have a big difference. As you can see now the elements are side by side, and that's what Flexbox does initially. So actually, if we get rid of this margin, you will see that they're placed one next to the other without no distance between them. Um, if we return the margin, that's what happens. So now let's go into the first property, which is flex direction. Um, Flex direction, as we said previously, has the default value of rho. So doing that does absolutely nothing. So we're good as we're gonna have the same result as if this property is present or not. But if we switch it from row to column, we have the previous layout we had with two extra properties. So now that we have switched the main and the cross axis, the main axis goes from top to bottom, and the cross axis goes from the left to the right. That's what happens when we have flex direction set to column. If we put it back to row, we have the normal default positioning of the axis. Now the main axis goes from left to right, and the top to bottom is the cross axis. Okay, so let's set that to column. There we go. Um, let's see what column reverse does. And as you can see now, the fifth element is first, fourth is the second, third, and so on. That's what column reverse does. Actually, the same is for row reverse. Now we can see, actually go back to row. There we have it. And if we put row reverse, that's what happens. So the axis is flipped, and now it goes from the right to the left, and that's why the first element is all the way here on the right. Okay. Actually, having the X direction set the column is really good if you're designing a responsive layout, because on smaller screens you can actually have all the elements in view, whereas if you have it set to row, all the elements will shrink and there will be no space, and they will just look cramped, whereas having it set to a column stacks them one on top of the other and makes them easily visible on smaller screens. That's something you should consider using in your project if you haven't done it yet. Okay, that were the first set of properties. Now let's see what justify content does. Let's actually go back to a row layout and see what justify content does. The first value is center, but let's first explain what justify content does. Let's actually reiterate what it does. Justify content is used to control how the items should be positioned along the main axis, so along the horizontal one, currently, because we have our flex direction to row right now. And so the first property's value is center. And immediately you can see that the items are centered along the main axis here from left to right. They are centered symmetrically. The space between them is equal, and we have this white space here to the left and to the right, which is also equal. This centers our items in the flex container, but it doesn't actually control the space between them. We manually did that before with the margin. So if we remove the margin, that's what happens. They get crammed one next to the other, and that's sometimes not what we want. So um, ha not having this margin property, we can um, just control the layout, actually give the control to the layout to Flexbox, and that can be done with the space between value. Now, Flexbox um, automatically calculates all the available space and distributes it evenly between the elements. Um, that that means that this space here is equal to this space, which is equal to this and this. And we didn't define any margin, any padding. Flexbox automatically calculates that. And to demonstrate this, we can shrink the browser like this, which is sort of a simulation of decreasing the viewport, so hopping on a tablet or a phone. And as you can see, as the viewport widens, the space between them grows automatically. So Flexbox is in charge of that. So if we decrease it, as you can see, calculation goes on in the background, and all the elements still fit and are perfectly positioned. That's what space between does. Now, if we put this space around, now equal space is put on the left and the right of every single flex item. So the space here on the left of the one, the first element, is equal to the space here on the left, on the right, actually, excuse me. So that goes the same for 2, 3, 4, and 5. So this space here is the is half of the total space between the first and the second element, because the second element also has the same white space here. So this, if we denote this space here by x, the space here will be twice x, because we have one x here and one x here. So that's what space around does. It leaves an extra space here on the right and on the left of the container, and positions the elements symmetrically on the main axis. There's another value here, which is spaced evenly, and that's sort of like a combination of space between and space around, because it has the same distance between the elements, but it leaves on the right space on the right and on the left, just like space around. It essentially distributes the available space evenly across all the flex items, just as it says in its name, space evenly. The next two values are flex end, which positions the elements on the end of the main axis. So remember, the main axis goes from the left to the right, and it positions them on the right. And I'm sure you can guess what flex start does. There we go. We position them in the beginning of the main axis. And that's all the properties on the flex container, actually, for the justify content. Now, let's get our margin back and set the justify content to center. And we will move on to the next Justify content control the positioning of the items along the main axis. Now we will use align items, control the positioning of the elements across the cross axis. Now that's the axis going from the top to the bottom. Now, in order for this to work, actually, one of the items has to be bigger than the others. So let's do this. Let's put a different class here, I2 on the second element, so we can apply unique styles to it. And let's set its height to 200 pixels. And as you can see, that's made all of the flex items increase, but we only wanted to increase the height of the second element. And that's actually what happens because the initial value of align items is stretch. That means that all the elements stretch um, as much as they can. So all the available space they have, they stretch across it. Now, firstly, we will do this. So we will demonstrate the center value of align items. And now you can see that indeed the second item has a bigger height than all the others. And all the flex items are centered in the middle of the cross axis. And the other items 1, 3, 4, and 5 are centered relative to this item, which has the biggest height, actually. Let's actually explore now. Flex start. That positions them in the beginning of the cross axis, so to the top. Flex end, the bottom. That's pretty simple. And there's also another value called baseline. In order for me to show this to you, I'll increase the fourth element's font size by adding another class, font size 70 pixels, and actually we'll get a bit more. So now this has the biggest font size of all of them, and by using baseline, we center what baseline does is to align the text on these flex items, so every flex item, um, to align all the items based on this content. So here the content of the elements is just the text, so that's what it uses to center. Actually, if we draw an invisible line here beneath the text, so the content of the flex items, we will see that they're centered along this line. If we can see that if we increase uh, even more the font size, they're still centered. So they're put on an invisible line. That's also the case if we decrease it. They're all on one line. And so that's what it baseline does. Let's remove this for now and return the align items to center. So now they're centered on the main and on the cross axis. And these are the properties for the container. What I want to show you now is how justify content and align items change when we modify the flex direction on the container. So right now it's a row, and if we set it to column, here what happens is they're centered again on the main axis, which now goes from top to bottom, and the cross axis from left to right. This also means that the cross axis is changed from top to bottom to left to right. Now, if we set align items, which controls the positioning of flex items on the cross axis, so for example, flex start, there they move here because now the cross axis starts on the left and ends on the right. Now, if we set justify content, so space between, actually nothing happens. That's because our container is not doesn't have enough height to accommodate this effect. And there we go. There it is. So space between. There's a little effect. So let's enlarge it even more to see it. If we do that on space between, it's gonna look like this. If we do it on space around, it puts extra space here, and it's generally the same if we have it the flex direction to row. Okay, so those are the main Flexbox properties we're gonna use. And now let's see what the align what the flex items have in terms of properties. Let's flip this back to center. See, flip this back to space between and bring this to the row. Okay, now the first one is align self. Let's actually remove this big height so I can see them. There we go. Okay, align self. That controls the positioning of the flex item along the cross axis on its own. So it's unique. Let's set it to flex end. And it moved down. So this is the end of the cross axis right now. And it's moved down. If we set it to flex start, moves up, and that's only the fourth element. All the others are aligned centrally, as you can see. If we set it to stretch, not stretch, but simply stretch, it stretches all the way. Okay, so in order for me to show how the order property works, it's actually the default property, the default value of the order property is 0. If we set it to a lower number, did you see that? The fourth move from here to here. The reason for that is that Flexbox orders the elements from the ones with the lowest order to the ones with the highest. So now the lowest order is -1 and all the others have 0, the default. So the lowest one is I4 and that's why the fourth element moves to the beginning. If we set it to actually let's leave it here and let's use fifth element to get a bit more clarity. I5 and let's set its order to something higher than 0 and that's 1. Actually the fifth element is already last, so that's not an appropriate example. Let's use the third element. And there we go. Now I3 has the biggest order and that's why it's placed all the way here to last. These three have 0 as their order, and this fourth element has -1. And that's how order works. It's very useful for responsive design again, because when you want to change the position of elements on a smaller, on a bigger screen, it really comes in handy. Now let's have a look at flex grow. This is the ability of an element to grow inside the container. The value we should give it is an integer, so it's 1, 2, 3, and let's set um, flex grow 1 here. Um, what we should say about flex grow is um, actually let's put this on all the items for one. So now they each occupy as much space as they can. And what this one here, this value 1 means is that each of the elements grows as much as they can. But this one is only relative to uh, all the other flex grow properties on all the other items. So flex 1 grow here is relative to the flex grow that we put on an I3 element. For example, if we put flex grow 2 here, the third element is twice as big as all the other elements, because flex grow is 2, which is twice bigger than flex grow 1, which we've said here. If we increase this to 3, now it's 3 times bigger. Let's try 0.5, now it's 2 times less than the others. Uh, and that's what flex grow does, actually. If we demonstrate what flex shrink does. Oh, actually, let's first test flex basis, and let's set this to 20%. Remember that flex basis dictates the width of the flex item, so we don't use width like this, actually, but that does nothing. Use flex basis for the width of flex items. That's as simple with that. We can use it actually to other units like pixels, and that's what we're going to use to demonstrate what flex shrink does. Watch what happens when I decrease the viewport, even if the flex basis of the third item is set to a fixed width of 300 pixels. So it should, this element should not shrink at all. But what happens actually is, as you can see, it shrinks. This is because the default value for flex shrink is 0, which says that it is allowed to shrink if the viewport is not enough to handle its width. So if we set flex grow to 1, now it should not shrink below 300 pixels. I don't know why that didn't work. Okay. Let's see that again. Oh, I really flex grow for some reason. Its flex shrink is set to 0. Now it should not shrink, and indeed it does. And that's why some elements fall out of the page as we resize the viewport. This allows us, actually we should use, as we said, the flex property instead of all these flex bases and flex rows and all that. So right now, please translate flex 0, 0, 300 pixels. The first one is for the flex row, for the flex shrink, and for the 300 flex bases pixels. Usually it will be 0, 1 and the width you want, because most of the time you're gonna want your elements to be able to shrink in order to not leave out any elements out of the page. And now that's pretty much all the properties we could apply to flex containers and items. As you can see, they are quite a lot, and mastering them will take a lot of practice. Um, I hope that this little preview of all the attributes is helpful for you to take a practical look at what Flexbox does. If you're interested, I can send you this pen. It's nothing complicated, really. You can play with it. Now, what I want to show you is a project that I built a time ago. This is it, and it makes use entirely of Flexbox. Here we have the heading, actually the header, the search bar, these are buttons here, and this is all aligned with Flexbox. Here we have a column layout again, aligned with Flexbox 2. Here we have another Flexbox container, another one, yet another Flexbox container. Here all you can see is Flexbox done. So it's really powerful CSS module Flexbox, and I assure you that you'll have much fun learning it if you take the time to. And finally, let's return to the presentation. With that, and I want to share with you some resources for learning Flexbox. These are the links to all of them. CSS Tricks, that's a famous website for CSS, for the CSS language. This is a really good guide. It has graphs, pictures that are nicely explained. Also, you can check out the Mozilla Developer Network's docs about Flexbox and play around with it. There are some nice examples. I've included a Flexbox cheat sheet. I love cheat sheets because it's an easy way to remember what property does what. The Flexbox Playground. This is a practical view of what all the attributes do in Flexbox. You should definitely check that out. And yet another guide to Flexbox by a different website. Check that out too if you have enough time. And actually the best resources for me personally are the Flexbox games that are built online. Both Flexbox Froggy and Flexbox Zombies are a really fun and really informative way to learning Flexbox, because you practically get to do something and look at the outputs of what you do, and it's fun too. It's they are both nicely created games, and you can always have fun with them while still learning something as important as Flexbox. And that's about it for me. Let's see if you have any questions. There's no questions right now. Let me stop screen sharing. And that's the end of the webinar. I wish you good luck in your studies. If you have any questions, be sure to reach out to me at any time. I wish you good luck with the projects, happy learning, and all the best from me. I look forward to hearing from you on Slack, and next week we will have yet another webinar, but more details on that in the following days. All the best from me, and have a nice evening. Bye bye.